let's talk about the brand new Panasonic Lumix S5. Now, this is a brand new full-frame camera from Panasonic Lumix. It sits alongside things like the S1, the S1R, the S1H. It probably has a lot more in common with the S1H than the other two. It's very much a video-focused camera, which we'll talk about in depth. But the interesting thing about this camera is how it's being priced and where it kind of sits in the market, because it's an incredibly capable video camera with a lot of pro specs, but it's sitting underneath the S1H and at a lower part of the market. But frankly, if someone was getting into videography, someone wanted to do it professionally, this is a fantastic camera. This is just a fantastic option. It makes me think, you know, when I was getting into videography, if this had been something as my first camera to get into video, crazy to think about what this can do. But we're going to get into all of that. So let's start off with some specs, and then we can go into what specifically has been improved, and then we can go from there. So first of all, we're talking about a 24.2 megapixel sensor, just like the S1H. We're talking about high res mode, so you can get 96 megapixels by using that mode. That essentially, when the camera's on a tripod, it'll take a series of pictures, stitch them together, and give you a nice big 96 megapixel high resolution shot. And as you'd expect, in terms of photography, it's got a lot of the things you would expect from a Panasonic camera, so burst shooting, 4K and 6K, so 60 frames a second, 30 frames a second, which is really decent for action shots. You've got things like live composite view, you've got stuff like time lapse, all that kind of stuff that you would expect is in there. But really what I want to talk about is the video side of stuff, because I think probably almost everyone is going to be interested in this camera for video reasons rather than photography reasons, although it is decent at photography as well, so good for hybrid shooters. There's also some interesting areas that I think Panasonic have specifically targeted as areas to improve, and in fact they actually mentioned to me there were 3 in particular. Now the big one for me is autofocus, because extensively using the S1, the S1R, the S1H, autofocus is the area that it has massively let me down. That is just an area where they just don't perform as well as I think they should. They hunt quite a lot, they don't lock on as well as I'd like, it's not reliable, so you end up often using manual focus. That has, I would say, massively been fixed to a large degree here with this camera. I'm going to show you what I did, a lot of the test stuff I did to actually test that stuff out, and we're going to go over that. But I would say straight up that autofocus is largely improved over what we've seen in the past. A couple of the other areas Panasonic mentioned as well as areas they wanted to target to improve: price, so actually coming in at a quite aggressive price I think with this one, and then size and weight, which isn't a massive problem I don't think, but this is definitely a lot lighter and smaller even than things like the S1 and the S1H, even than the GH5S, which I've done some side by side so you can see all that kind of stuff. It is noticeably smaller than all of those. So video is where this camera really shines, so let's just dive into the spec about that, then we can talk about what it's like to actually shoot with it. So 4K, obviously up to 60 frames a second, so we've got 4K 60p in there. Up to 60p is 10-bit 420, and then 30p, 25p, 24p, that's all 10-bit 422. So you've got some nice pro specs in there. Now in terms of time limits, which I know is very important for this kind of camera, 4K up to 30 frames a second, 8-bit, no time limit. 4K 60 frames a second, 30-minute time limit. However, I don't think that's really a problem. I can't imagine why you'd want to shoot 4K 60 frames a second for more than 30 minutes. It's also not a problem with overheating, which absolutely was pointed out to me 100%. It's just that there's a time limit and then you restart another file, so it's not a problem. But I can't imagine a situation where you're shooting 30 minutes of 60 frames a second 4K footage. I would imagine if you're shooting for that long, you're probably doing something like an interview or something like that where you would, I would imagine, shoot at a lower frame rate. But if you do need to shoot that, it just stops at 30-minute start new file. It's got Vlog pre-installed on the camera already, so no need to get some kind of update for that. Great news. That means we can jump straight in with stuff like Vlog, which is great. It means you can get really, really good dynamic range using that kind of shooting. So if you want to shoot in high contrast areas or just generally, and then you want to color grade afterwards, that's a great option for you. I actually shot a lot in the kind of standard color profile because I like to see what it can do. I like to see what it looks like, and I actually really like the look of it, to be honest. But I did shoot some Vlog as well, which looks fantastic, I think. Now, in terms of low light shooting, it's got dual native ISO in there, so it performs really quite well for low light. I was shooting a bit in the forest, a lot at ISO 3200 or even 6400 because it was a little bit darker in there. You know, there was a bit more cloud, so it wasn't as light. but absolutely no issue at all. And in terms of color grading afterwards, no problem at all. I didn't find it was particularly noisy, so that dual native ISO working very well. A couple of other things worth mentioning for video, you've got things like time codes, waveforms, zebra, things you'd probably expect from more of a pro video camera. A recording frame indicator, so a nice red frame around the box, which sounds like a little thing, but it's actually quite a big deal, especially if you're shooting yourself and you want to make sure it is definitely recording, or if you're just filming and you just know it's recording or you know it's not. It's quite a handy thing to have. It means you're never going to have the slip up where it's not recording. It's also important to mention that everything I shot, video and photo, but specifically let's talk about video for a second, it was all handheld, so no gimbal work or anything like that, which is generally how I perform in videos anyway. There's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, as I've mentioned in a few other videos, it's way more interesting and way more useful to do that because you get to see how the camera performs in handheld conditions. You know how it's going to perform on a gimbal. If I pop it on my Ronin, it's going to look great. It's going to look very smooth, but that's because I'm not really testing out the camera in that situation. I'm testing out the gimbal for how smooth it's going to be. If I shoot handheld, I get to see how usable that is. I get to test that out, and I wasn't using 120 frames a second or 240 frames a second to fall back on. I primarily shot 4K 50 frames a second because I'm doing in PAL, but also a little bit of 4K 25 as well. So I'm not slowing it down and using that to kind of smooth out the footage. I'm just using it handheld, and it's got 6.5 stops of image stabilization. And I've got to say, if you've used the S1, the S1R, the S1H, the image stabilization is where this shines. It is fantastic. And it means that you can shoot handheld without really worrying about it at all. And I'm talking about walking around handheld, not just kind of a bit of this, but properly walking and following a subject. It's great. And it's really nice to see it in this camera. So let's talk about autofocus. Now, I mentioned earlier, this is an area that Panasonic really wanted to improve. It's an area they needed to improve as well because they were falling behind and it just wasn't working as well as anyone would probably like. Now, it's not a totally new hardware situation when it comes to autofocus, but it is very much a reworked algorithm and software and all that kind of stuff. And I'm very happy to say it does work a lot better than in cameras like the S1 or the S1R or the S1H. It works an awful lot better. It's a big difference. So face, eye detection in video, in photo works. And I'm happy to say, including subject detection, it was working really well for pretty much all of the stuff that I shot. So whether I had my subject through some leaves, which I was kind of trying to test out, I was trying to trick it a little bit into not being able to see where she was, or having her move around a lot or anything like that, it was able to either get her eye, her face, or just her as a subject. It just knew that she was what I wanted to focus on, which is very handy, especially in video. When you're shooting handheld, you're able to rely on it a lot more. Now, I did this test. I used the 50mm f1.4 lens, which is obviously a fantastic lens, but I used that because I wanted to really try and see how good this autofocus would be. You know, f1.4, that is a very shallow depth of field. So I wanted to see how it was going to perform under those kind of circumstances. So I obviously had to bump up the shutter speed, so forgive me for that, but otherwise this is what I found. So I had my subject moving towards the camera, moving away from the camera, twisting around. It seems to work really well. You know, you can see for yourself what you think, but it wasn't doing loads of hunting. It wasn't trying to find her all the time. It was pretty much keeping up with her. Now, there were a couple of times where it didn't keep up with her and it did lose her for a second, but it seemed to get her back really quickly. So it's still not maybe the best autofocus I've ever used, but certainly it's a lot better than it used to be on the S1 and the S1H and that kind of thing. When I was generally shooting with it over the time I had it as well, I found it actually to be pretty reliable, whether we were out in the forest, whether we were in a high contrast situation, whether we had sun, backlighting, all that kind of stuff. It did seem to work, which was great. There were a couple of instances, I'm not going to pretend there weren't, there were a couple of instances where it did lose focus for a second, but you know, what can you do? It's not going to be perfect, but it is significantly improved from where it was at. So in terms of actual technical specs with the autofocus, the face and the eye detection is 2 times faster. Picking up your subject, whether it's a human or an animal, is 5 times faster. And it's got head recognition. So a little bit like we tested in our kind of, where we've got a model moving back and forward and turning around, it can detect whether you've got the front or the back of the head. So it's, even if you turn around, it's still going to be able to stay locked onto your subject. It's not going to start hunting around for whatever it's looking for. So that's how it's able to do that. In terms of the other areas that Panasonic specifically said they wanted to improve, size and weight, I think they've done that. Absolutely. I mean, this is very small, compact, easy to carry around. Absolutely. I mean, when you compare it to something like the S1R, which I've got compared for you so you can see that, or even the GH5S, it is a lot smaller, and that's nice. It's nice to be able to carry it around with that. It means that it's a very effective backup camera for a bigger shoot, for a bigger production, a very effective B-cam for interviews and things like that. But it also means that someone getting into video, this is amazing. This is really amazing for someone who wants to do that. And let's touch on that for a second. So if you were someone who wants to get into video, you've got 10-bit video in here, 422, 4K up to 60 frames a second, full HD, high frame rates as well. But that's a lot. That's a lot of spec for the kind of price that this is. And when you look at what this is going up against in the market, this is a hugely interesting camera for videographers wanting to get pro level specs without completely breaking the bank. There's more lenses available now than there were obviously when we first saw the S1 and the S1R. There's way more. Sigma releasing them. There's more affordable options than just the big 50mm f1.4, which is a lot of money. You don't have to get that. You can look at Sigma lenses and things like that. There's a lot to look at now. So this is an incredibly interesting camera, I think, for videographers, for the video market, because it's very, attainable. It's very accessible. And I'm not going to pretend that £2,000 isn't a lot of money. It still is a lot of money. But this is very interesting because as a tool, it's much more accessible than some other cameras to get similar sort of pro specs. Let's talk quickly about what it's like to actually shoot with as well. Now, obviously it's really quite small, it's relatively compact. That I think works in its favor in a lot of ways. It would be really easy to pop on a gimbal. We talked about shooting with a handheld. It's got a nice comfortable grip on it. The buttons are very ergonomic in terms of their placement and stuff like that. If you're familiar with Panasonic cameras already, like an S1, S1H, something like that, you'll be right at home here. With a free angle LCD screen as well, so it's super easy to see what you're shooting even without an external monitor. One thing that's important to mention about the actual camera itself, it's a micro HDMI rather than the full size. I think some people will have wanted the full size, but to be honest, I think it's micro because of the size of the camera. I think it has to be micro to keep the camera size down a little bit. Is it the end of the world? I don't think so, but it's worth pointing out. Now lastly, I think there's something else we should talk about, which I talked about with Panasonic. This camera sounds fantastic, I think. But there's more that they actually told us. There are firmware updates coming in 2020. And these are not paid firmware updates. These are just kind of plans they've got to improve the camera. So later in 2020, they're going to add support for RAW video via the HDMI output. And they were talking about 5.9K RAW up to 30 frames a second, which means that this camera at this kind of price point is crazy what it can do. Absolutely crazy, super impressive. I am very impressed by that. I cannot wait to try that out because at this kind of price and this kind of size camera, that is amazing. There's also going to be support for Cinema 4K and vector scopes as well. So just generally, they're going to be looking to improve this camera over time as well. But having 5.9K RAW, 30 frames a second in this kind of camera, mind-blowing. Plus all the other stuff you've got in there. This is an incredible deal for someone looking to get into pro video, but without spending crazy money. Now, I've done my absolute best to get to know this camera as much as possible over the time that I've had it. I've tried out as many different things as I can, but if you have any questions, anything that we've not touched on in the video, absolutely pop it all down in the comments below. I will get back to you as soon as I can with as much detail as possible. If you like the video as well, give it a thumbs up, make sure to subscribe. I find that to be incredibly helpful and I would take it as a personal favour from you to me. I will of course see you in the next video and, as always, thanks for watching.